Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started tonight. So if you all will find your way to your seat, that would be fabulous. I'm Christine White, and I am the Executive Director for the Village Square. And on behalf of Leon County Government and the Village Square, I'd like to welcome you to our 7th annual Created Equal. Who can imagine that it's been 7 years? Very exciting. Over the past 7 years, we've looked back at things like the 60th anniversary of the Tallahassee lunch counter sit-ins. We've listened to the last words of the unarmed. And last year, we commemorated a new holiday, Florida Emancipation Day. It's very exciting, those of you who are able to join us. This year's event continues Created Equal's tradition of bringing people together of different backgrounds to have candid conversations about race in our community. And to explain a little bit more to you about tonight's program, I'd like to introduce to you Royal King, who is Volunteer Services Manager for Leon County.
Good evening again. Good evening. All right. Thank you, Christine. I'm happy to be here for this impactful program on behalf of Leon County government. Today's timely conversation about voting continues the main purpose of Created Equal, bringing people together to have hard conversations about race within our community. While most citizens have the right to vote in the United States, experts state that measures such as strict voter ID laws, restricted registration, and narrowed voting times disproportionately impact people of color. Today, we'll ask you to examine 2 questions. Are elections fair and safe and secure for everyone? Should we be doing more? Before we begin the program, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Leon County Board of County Commissioners, whose vision makes this whole program possible. Now I'd like to introduce Commissioner Cummings, Leon County Commissioner at Large, to welcome you to the program. We can clap for that.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I am Carolyn Cummings, and I want to welcome each of you to the Created Equal program. So on behalf of the Leon County Board of County Commissioners and our chairperson, William Bill Proctor, who was not unable to be here, welcome again to each of you. I want to thank Mr. Royal King, and thanks to the Village Square for the great partnership they have fostered with the county. And that partnership makes this program possible. Tonight, I am very, very proud to be here with you for the 7th annual Created Equal event to discuss one of the most fundamental rights we hold in this country, and that is the right to vote. Since 2015, Created Equal has engaged in thousands of citizens' conversations about race with a local lens. This award-winning program was designed to create a space where we all ask the hard questions to be able to break down barriers. I want to take a moment to recognize our amazing panel and our amazing moderator, all of whom you will hear more about in just a few minutes. But we have the renowned Dr. Keith Parker. Let's give him a round of applause. We have Professor Michael Morley. Dr. Sharon Austin. And of course, our great moderator, Mr. Tom Flanagan. I would also like to recognize my colleagues on the Board of County Commissioner. If there are any here tonight, will you stand and be recognized? Thank you. I also want to recognize our county staff and the best county administrator on planet Earth, Mr. Vince Long, who is here tonight as well. Let's give it. Not only I want to just thank each of you for joining us tonight, I encourage each of you to actively engage in this conversation. We want you to candidly share your thoughts. We want you to listen to the thoughts of others, and we want you to embrace the ideas of others. I personally look forward to the conversation ahead and hope that we will all leave here this evening as advocates for voter engagement among our families, among our friends, and clearly throughout our community. Again, thank each of you for joining us tonight. And now I turn it back over to Mr. Royal King and Ms. Christine White. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cummings. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our very own Leon County Supervisor of Elections office. You may have seen them as you came into the building. They had staff out front. If you didn't stop by their table before the program, please stop by there on your way out to get some more voter education information. Additionally, thank you to our table leads. I'd like to specifically call out Mr. Skier with the ACLU of Florida. Thank you for being here with us. I see his table there. All right. So we'll begin the program with a panel discussion that will include an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll ask questions to the panel at the end of the discussion, their discussion. Following the panel discussion, per Created Equal tradition, we'll turn it over to all of you to have conversations at your very own tables. I'll now hand it back to Christine to introduce our amazing moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Royal. Yes, I get the best honor, I think, here tonight to introduce the amazing Tom Flanagan, who I really know doesn't really need much of an introduction in this town. I've come to kind of think of him as the voice of Tallahassee. But for those of you who might be watching us online or, a little less not been here as long, Tom Flanagan is the program director for news at WFSU. And he's been there since 2006. Sorry to date things, Tom. I hate when people do that. But he's been covering local personalities, issues, and organizations. He's a big friend of the Village Square and Leon County, I know. He began his broadcast career more than a lot of years ago. I won't do that to you either. Before that, and he covered news for several radio stations here in Florida, also in Texas, and his home state of Maryland. Any Marylanders out there? No, sorry, Tom. Woo, Maryland. In between, he spent a number of years in corporate communications for a few private firms, and that's the time that he calls invaluable for giving him a greatly expanded media perspective. So join me in a great big round of applause for Tom.
Oh, me, oh, my. Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciate it. Thank you again to the Village Square and to Leon County government for this 7th annual Created Equal presentation. And we decided, after all of the controversy and all of the contention and all of the problems attendant to those many previous topics, we would kick back, we would relax, and we would do something without a trace of controversy or disagreement, and of course that is race relations in connection with elections. What could we all rally around more than that. So anyway, I want to introduce you to our phenomenal panel who really will be doing all the heavy lifting here, folks. And let's start here with a gentleman who is right here on my right and your left. We met actually on the radio earlier today. Michael was one of our guests on today's Perspectives to kind of give people a foretaste of what we'd be talking about tonight. But you need to meet this guy. Michael is a professor of law at Florida State University. He teaches and writes in the areas of election law, constitutional law, remedies, and the federal courts. And his research focuses on election emergencies, which we never have in Florida, ever. Also, the constitutional right to vote, the Electoral Count Act, the equitable powers of the federal courts. He's also testified before congressional committees. A congressional subcommittee, by the way, was in town just yesterday. He's presented to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, taken part in bipartisan blue ribbon groups to develop election reforms, and his work has been published in many of the nation's top law reviews. He's appeared on C-SPAN, Court TV, Fox News, local news programs. He's been quoted in several national publications. He joins us tonight, Michael Morley. Right next to Michael is Dr. Sharon Austin, professor of political science at the University of Florida, and has also taught courses at the universities of Louisville, Michigan, and Missouri, Columbia. Her teaching interests are in American government, urban politics, and African American politics. Research interests include African American mayoral elections, African American / Caribbean American political relationships, rural African American political activism, and African American political behavior. She's published several articles and book chapters on related topics, in addition to 3 books: Race, Power, and Political Emergence in Memphis, The Transformation of Plantation Politics in the Mississippi Delta, and The Caribbeanization of Black Politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sharon Austin. And right next door to the good doctor is another doctor, Dr. Keith Parker, professor of sociology and criminal justice at Florida A&M University, author and co-author of numerous articles, including Using Microaggression to Examine U.S. Voter Suppression Tactics. I have got to read that. Also, Voter Participation in the Absence of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. He's the founder and CEO of the National Education and Empowerment Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering individual lives through the pursuit of education, healthy communities, and civic engagement. Dr. Keith Parker. Folks, let's sit down. Let's take a load off and get this show on the road, as it were. We have a number of questions that have already been prepared for our consideration, and I'll give everyone an opportunity to handle them here. And we'll also be taking some questions from the audience, which we will leaven into the conversation as we go. And Dr. Sharon, I think if we could start you off with this one, and then we'll go down the rest of our panelists here. This is a question that, gosh, you hear it every single day in the media and elsewhere. Are voter access and voter security opposing concepts? Are they totally different? Do they intersect at some point? What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are,
let's see. There we go. Yeah.
I hope y'all can hear me okay.
There you go.
But I think that both of them are necessary. Voter access, of course, is important because everyone, we believe in one person, one vote. Every person should have an equal opportunity to vote and to elect their preferred representatives. But voter security is also important because you hear so many allegations about election fraud, and we don't want that. You hear so many allegations about elections being stolen, and so we don't want that. So you want to make sure that when your vote is cast that it will be counted legitimately. But the problem is that there's a big conflict in the sense that even though we know that both of these things are important, I think with some of the restrictions that are placed there and the rationale behind them is that they make for secure elections. I think the allegation is that many of those restrictions are discriminatory at worst and are biased at best. And so that's where the conflict comes in, because we want to have both things, but the question is, how do we achieve voter security without depriving any particular groups of their right to vote?
Okay, Michael, do you have any thoughts along that line there? Are these independent and exclusive aspirations, or do they combine in some way, shape, form, or fashion?
No, I think they're absolutely complementary to each other. And certainly if you look historically at most of the major federal statutes that were enacted to protect voting rights in general, and in particular the voting rights of African Americans, things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 itself, various Reconstruction era statutes, including the Enforcement Act of 1870, these were statutes that both expanded the right to vote, created protections for the right to vote, prevented discrimination with regard to the right to vote, but also had very strong election integrity provisions, anti-fraud provisions, especially because during the Reconstruction era, voter fraud was one of the mechanisms that was used to disenfranchise African American voters, that in jurisdictions where they hadn't been deterred by the threat of violence from casting their ballots, those ballots were simply nullified or diluted through fraudulent votes cast afterwards. So throughout most of American history, expanding access, protecting the right to vote was seen as a complementary goal with ensuring adequate security, preventing, and it's not just fraud, by the way, which is a legal term that connotes, a particular mental state, but mistake, accident, irregularity, other types of electoral problems. Throughout most of our history, those goals have been complementary to each other. Right? It's really only in more recent years that the issue has become more politicized, the target of more partisan machinations that really aren't intrinsic to the issue, that can very easily be excised so that we can return to achieving both goals.
Okay, and Dr. Keith, we're also hearing day by day that there is a gulf, there is a separation between electoral integrity and voter access. The more people who vote, the more likely becomes the possibility of fraud or connivance or any of these kinds of things. So how do you pull these two together, get people to say, yeah, the two can live as one, or at least pretty darn close?
Well, I too think they are complementary, and we have to look no further than the last national election, when we had perhaps one of the largest turnouts in recent history, and it was one of the most secure elections according to most prognosticators and evaluators of the last election. I think the real fraud that is being perpetrated in this country is the poor turnout among us who, for whatever reason, choose not to participate. And I do believe there are those out there who want to confuse us and cause us to think that our votes do not count. But like Commissioner Commons, I am a product of Mississippi and grew up on the backs of a number of people who use the mantra, if you don't vote, you don't count. And so I consider them complementary, and they go hand in hand.
Okay, while we're with you here, Dr. Parker, let's look at the main impediments, the main challenges when it comes to equal access by race, because so many of the speed bumps, and they may be much larger than speed bumps that are being put up right now, seem to have some kind of a racial overtone, that people of color are most inordinately impacted by these things. So what are your thoughts on those major challenges to voting when it comes to race?
The major impact is transportation to and from voting polls. And transportation becomes important when we look at the distance in which a number of people have to travel and the long lines in which individuals stand just to vote. So again, the biggest problem is transportation to and from, and also a growing problem is disinformation. We want to discourage people from participating in their constitutional obligation because the vote is sacred, it is profane, and again, if we believe in the mantra, if you don't vote, you don't count, I take a great deal of interest in trying to encourage people to come to the realization that the vote must be very important. Otherwise, people would not engage in the many, many activities to discourage voter participation and literacy.
Okay, Dr. Austin, any other factors that you see impinging on the inclination, the possibility of people of color to cast ballots that stand in the way here?
I would say, especially with black voters in Florida, the changes in the voting laws, there are so many frequent changes in laws. And one of the things that was changed a few years ago was Sunday voting. In some communities, they have souls to the polls, is what it's called, in a lot of African-American churches. And that was eliminated for a while, and then it was reinstated. But that was just one of the many changes that have taken place in voting laws. I even remember growing up in Memphis and going to these large, predominantly African-American mega churches, and how excited people would be on Election Day. And after church, they would even have buses, and they would have almost like caravans that would take people to the polls. There would be a celebration. And they do the same thing on Sundays in some communities here in Florida as well. And that's something that happens in a lot of African-American communities. And so when that was removed, it was immediately a lawsuit was filed by civil rights groups because it was pretty suspect. And it was pretty obvious that it was directed at one particular group of voters that took advantage of that. But I would say not only long lines, but other problems as well that tend to happen disproportionately in poor communities, which are disproportionately populated by people of color, by African Americans and Latinos. And that is with the problems with the machinery in Florida, especially in 2000, we were the laughingstock of the nation. But in every presidential election, it seems, with the exception of this last one, it seems that there are major problems on Election Day. And so that discourages people from wanting to vote on Election Day because they know that there are going to be long lines. The lines tend to be longer, research has shown, in black communities, at polls in minority communities. And then also there's always the probability that the machine might break down. That also happens disproportionately in African American and Latino poor communities. And so those are some of the things as well. But I think another problem, and I think we're probably going to get into this tonight, is with early voting. I mean, the problem, I think, especially is with vote by mail. And people don't trust that because there's always the suspicion that you may not sign it right or they might invalidate your ballot for some reason. And so that's why a lot of people wait until Election Day to vote, but there are so many problems in minority communities. And those are the types of things that happen that people just really don't think very much about.
And then that plays back into the long lines and all of these other things here. Michael Morley, anything else you can think of that stands in the way here?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that also, it's important to underscore another issue, right? When you think about things like early voting or voter ID laws, in order to assess the impact and in order to ensure that there aren't substantial racially disparate impacts, it's important to get into the weeds, right? So something like a voter ID law. What types of IDs are and aren't acceptable? How difficult is it to get an identification, right? For members of some communities, just the cost of getting, even if the ID card itself is free, if used for voting purposes, the cost of a birth certificate could be enough to deter them from being able to get an identification card. So once you really get into the weeds, right? What are the hours of the DMV offices? Are people who are working by the hour even able to realistically access a DMV office to be able to get the requisite ID, right? It's one thing to have the political debates over, should we have voter ID or not, but at least to a large part, potential racially disparate impacts could be mitigated, could be reduced, could hopefully even be eliminated by working out those details in the weeds, getting rid of fees for having a birth certificate, ensuring adequate access to motor vehicle offices, things like that, ensuring that polling places, to the extent we're talking about long lines, ensuring that polling places are adequately staffed, have adequate machines, right? Part of the problem is that historically elections have been run in a very decentralized manner, a very localized manner, where there were, and I mean, to a certain extent, right, we see this with our constitutional structure of county-based supervisors of elections, and so that structure historically tended to facilitate disparities between wealthier communities and poorer communities, which again is something that the state itself could take steps to mitigating, to balancing out, to ensuring that poorer communities, historically marginalized communities, have the resources they need. So there are enough people staffing the polling locations.
Whether it is we have big problems and we have to have a more secure system regardless of how that comes out, or this is just a perceptual problem that we need to overcome? Starting with you, Michael, what additional security, reasonable, rational, equitable security protocols can be put in place so people say, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now I feel much more confident about casting a ballot?
I think that the system is secure. I think that again, the 2020 election has numerous experts have looked at it. The results of the election have been challenged in state and federal courts. We have a secure system. You can be confident, particularly in the way that Florida runs its elections. I mean, we can talk about ways of expanding access further. We can talk about, again, sort of some of the nuts and bolts technical details about, well, are there other databases we can be cross-referencing our voter registration lists against to try to ensure that that there aren't duplicate records, or that some of the records haven't become outdated, or that people are actually qualified to vote, right? So I mean, we can certainly have like in the weeds, nuts and bolts technical conversations about particular parts of the process, but overall, I don't think that there is one like major big picture item that is a gaping hole in our security that's essential that the legislature fundamentally change the system.
Okay, Dr. Sharon, same thought from you, or do you have a different take on that?
I would pretty much agree, because in 2020, a lot of elected officials and a lot of scholars and activists all praised Florida. And Florida was seen as sort of the model community or the model state for election reform, and with the problems that had existed in the 2000 election 20 years later in 2020, a lot of people praised Florida because of the efficiency of the elections in 2020. And then shortly after that, there was another law that was passed that brought about reform, and also that was, I guess the allegation was that it was designed to sort of avoid and combat election fraud, but there was no real evidence of it. So I guess before you talk about trying to further secure an election, you have to first of all show that there's a need for it. And I don't know, I guess it's something that you all can debate, but I think it's kind of debatable here in Florida as to whether there are any additional requirements necessary to secure elections when Florida was praised for its efficiency in 2020.
It sounds like a consensus, so I guess then it falls to you, Dr. Parker. Are these further complications actually trying to accomplish something else?
My take on it is the challenge is not the system, the lack of security in our political system. The challenge is us. We have to fix ourselves and come to the realization, based on the overwhelming evidence from the last election, that our voting system is extremely secure. It was the last election. I'm very concerned about what's going to happen in the future, because a lot of the naysayers, a lot of the conspiracy theorists are seeking these offices and these positions where I am convinced if they get in positions to do what they want to do, then our system will be challenged. So again, I think the challenge is us more so than the system. And that is where the work needs to begin, with us.
One final question here as we come back here just prior to taking some input from the audience here. And since we're with you, Dr. Keith, what is your biggest fear then moving forward? We have an election coming up here in a matter of months. There's not a lot of time to either implement some of the things we were talking about here this evening, not so much the mechanics of the election, but to change hearts and minds so that people go, yes, I am confident in the system, regardless of who I am or where I am, and I can cast a ballot and be sure that that vote is going to count. What is your biggest fear? And then we'll come back.
My biggest fear is we are becoming too single issue oriented. Some of us decide not to participate in the process because a politician says one thing that we do not like. I think we need to look at the big picture and look at our political system as a system with all of its intricacies and come to the realization that there is a reason why some individuals are spending millions of dollars to get into these offices that pay $170,000, $174,000 for a congressperson or a senator. Why are they so vested in spending so much money in these positions? And I think it's because of the power and the ability to persuade us, too many of us, in my estimation, in the wrong direction. And they are casting in our minds the doubt that I think is unfounded.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rustin, what do you think on that?
Real quick, I just wanted to let our audience know, because I'm not sure if we were clear. You have little pieces of white paper, just little blank sheets of paper on the tables, and some pens if you'd like to write down your audience questions, and then you just hold it up into the air and we'll grab them for you and we'll bring them up to Tom. Just wanted to make sure you didn't wonder how the heck you were going to ask your question.
Thanks so much, Christine. Appreciate that. Yeah, that's very helpful if you write them down. Just screaming them from the pit here sometimes doesn't have the same impact. But Dr. Austin, what are you afraid of? What kind of keeps you up at night in this regard?
Well, I think that Dr. Keith just made a really good point about the problem is us. I think the problem is systematic, but also I think the problem is with turnout. And there are two problems that I see. One that I've already mentioned is that I think people see the importance of voting in presidential elections, but not in local elections. And so many of the most important decisions are made at the local and the state level, and those are the elections that people are less likely to participate in. And so that's something, in thinking about the fact that the midterm elections are coming up this year, and the turnout tends to be much smaller among certain groups, especially among younger people during midterm elections. That's something that really concerns me, because that's one of the things that we haven't mentioned tonight, is that there's a big difference when it comes to age, because you have a lot of younger people who are not as motivated to vote or to participate in politics. And that's something that also we need to address, their mistrust in the system, because these are the people who are the least likely to vote. And so I think that's the biggest issue, is the turnout in the midterm elections, and just turnout generally among certain groups of voters is really low. And that's something that a lot of organizations, a lot of elected officials, a lot of community activists really need to look closely into that.
Yeah, well, which kind of flies in the face of the old conventional wisdom. I recall a time in which the voter turnout was considered a mark of pride. If you could get up around 70 or 80% voter turnout, oh, that was a wonderful thing. In several elections now, it's slipped down around 20%. And no one blinks an eye and thinks that's a bad thing. I don't know, Michael, is it because the fewer people who vote, the less chance for fraud? I mean, have we really bought into this, or what?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look statistically at voter turnout statistics, right, one of the primary determinants of voter turnout is just what type of an election it is, right? As you might expect, right, we have highest turnout, typically hinging around two-thirds of the electorate for presidential elections. That drops down to about 40 to 45% for most congressional elections. If you're talking about just a purely local election, it is not unusual to have single-digit turnout. And a lot of that, again, cycles back to both the perceived importance of particular offices, the extent to which people even know who the candidates for those offices are, the extent to which people are aware of the major issues that those particular offices have control over. And so I think that, to the extent that the media covers elections differently, there's obviously different amounts of funding being put into campaign contributions, campaign expenditures for different types of elections. That's all going to feed into this differential turnout based on what is the level of office? Is it a primary? Is it a general? I think more broadly, structurally, one of our main concerns should be ensuring that whoever wins an election, particularly with regard to a presidential election, both sides are willing to accept that electoral process as legitimate, right? Even if you don't like the candidate who won, that you're nevertheless willing to acknowledge the fact that, yes, that person is in fact the winner, right? Where we get into a very dangerous area is if you have, right, a substantial portion of one side that's not willing to accept the results of an election. That jeopardizes, that calls into question the possibility of a peaceful transfer of power, and particularly to the extent that you're talking about the office of president, that it's hard to imagine a more dangerous threat to the electoral system than a public unwillingness to coalesce around a winner. And at some of our most vulnerable points in history, there had been, I mean, the election of 1876, right? Up until a few days before Inauguration Day, there were 2 inaugurations being planned. There were generals in the United States Army taking sides about which of the candidates, Hayes or Tilden, they thought had actually won the election. That's not a situation we can ever come anywhere back near.
Well, we got some audience questions. Oh, you guys are so thoughtful and insightful, and these are terrific. So I will just throw these out, and whoever wants to handle it, just wave a hand here. Instead of all of this folderol about what we should be doing, let's just make it mandatory, okay? And one of our audience members suggested, would mandatory voting be much better? And if not, why? It's not just your civic obligation. It is your your civic mandate. Boy, we hate the word mandate. So would that be good, do you think? I don't think it's in the Constitution, but could that work? Possibly, maybe.
I don't really know if that would work because, I mean, in a democracy, you can't mandate that people vote. And then also you'd have to think about the fact of how would you accomplish that if there was a rule that said that everyone over the age of 18 has to vote, of the age of 18 or over has to vote. How would you force them to do that? And then also what would be the consequences if they chose not to?
Yeah, it's kind of going back to the draft. We remember that. That wasn't too popular, was it? Is that but nobody thinks that's a good idea, right? Or at least not a workable idea. You know, okay.
Even if you were able to force people to show up at the polling place, you can't force them to fill out the ballot. So one possible outcome would be just an increase in the number of undervotes. Or, again, there's political science evidence showing that if people don't know what's going on with an election, if people aren't familiar with particular candidates, they'll either just tend to go have the primacy effect. They'll just tend to vote for whichever candidate is listed first on the ballot. Sometimes you will see a recency effect. They'll vote for whoever's last. You basically never want to be in the middle of the ballot. That's the main takeaway from that. But I mean, you might have, even to the extent you have more actual votes being cast, they'll more likely be the result of simply randomness or these heuristics rather than actually reflecting the will of the people in any meaningful sense. So I would definitely be against any form of mandatory voting.
Yeah, and if that occurred, there certainly would be some interesting comments put into the space provided for write-in candidates, I'm sure. We got some nuts and bolts questions here, too. Where's Mark Early when we really need him? We know he's at a meeting in Orlando, but does Florida purge voter rolls? And if so, why? Let's see.
So the word purge is pejorative. And of course, to the extent that the state has engaged in efforts to remove people believed to be ineligible from the rolls, that critics have sometimes attacked that as a purge. Federal law, actually, a law you might heard or referred to as the Motor Voter Bill, the National Voter Registration Act, both requires states to ensure the accuracy of their voter registration records. HAVA actually confirms that's the Help America Vote Act passed after Bush v. Gore in 2003, confirms the duty that when you have voter registration records, you have to ensure their accuracy. And to the extent that a state believes that somebody has moved or that somebody's records have been outdated, they're not allowed to just remove them. Rather, they have to send out a non-forwardable postcard to the address they have on record saying, hey, it looks like you moved, or at least we have reason to believe you might have moved. Can you please just sign this to confirm that you're still here? To the extent that in past years the state has been overly aggressive in sending out postcards like that, those types of updating efforts have been attacked as purges. But to the other extreme, where if the state isn't updating its voter registration list, if you have 2, 3, 4 records for people that you've never updated the list based on if they move or if they die or if they're no longer in the state or things like that, then the voter registration records aren't able to play that role of ensuring smooth elections, both help facilitating access as well as guaranteeing security that they're supposed to. So I think that that's an excellent example of where you have to have a balance. You don't want to be too strict where you're throwing off people for no reason and without notice and without due process. But on the other hand, if you don't have any reasonable efforts to ensure the roll's accuracy, you might as well not have them in the first place.
Here's an interesting one that delves a little bit back into history, and that is, over the years, how has different issues of race and elections manifested itself, or are we still talking about essentially the same topics that have been part and parcel of this discussion since Reconstruction? Has there been a change? With the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, everything changed, and now we're moving backwards now that that act is no longer fully. How has that played out? Dr. Parker?
Well, quickly, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And when we go back to the 1800s, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, African-American men voted in significant numbers. There was a backlash to that. We come forward to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There has been chipping away at that piece of legislation since it was signed into law, August 6, 1965. Fast forward to some other considerations. When we look at the Citizens United case in about 2007, and then, of course, Shelby v. Holder, 2013, people move in different directions for a variety of reasons. And I think it's imperative for us to come to the realization that if we want secure elections, there have to be these safeguards. If we want the populace to feel its voice matters, we, the members of society, must encourage, must cajole our fellow citizens to participate in this magnificent process to ensure not only the security of our communities, but also the representation of our well-being.
Here is a question I knew was going to come up when I saw certain people walk in tonight. Amendment 4. Could anyone address the status of felons who were given the right to vote? That was by constitutional vote of the electorate, but were then hampered by the statutory requirement that they pay fees and fines that they may or may not have been able to determine in order to qualify to vote. And in many cases, there were inadequate records to really figure out, have you or have you not paid all fees and fines attendant to the felony that you committed, and since we can't figure that out, you're not going to be able to vote. Yeah. Tag, you're it.
So in part, I would suggest part of the reason this issue arose was from the phrasing of Amendment 4. Amendment 4 allowed a person to regain their eligibility to vote upon completion of their sentence. It didn't have to be drafted that way. It could have instead it could have been proposed if you, upon completion of your term in prison or upon your release from custody, right? A much more clearer and more specific provision. So I would take a little bit of issue with the notion that this was purely a statutory call. If you ask a lawyer, or particularly if you ask a criminal defense attorney, if you get a criminal fine, is that your sentence? It's on your sentence sheet. It's what you are sentenced to. So I would suggest this issue could have been avoided altogether simply by drafting Amendment 4 in a way that clarified that your rights are restored immediately upon your release from incarceration, rather than using a legal term of art like sentence that encompasses these sorts of monetary aspects. Having said that, the challenge then arises. This amendment was adopted through the initiative process without an infrastructure in place where the state was able to immediately and reliably tell people, here's how much you still owe, here's what your obligations are, here's what you're required to do before you're eligible to vote. And there's been constitutional litigation, there's been constitutional challenges. The state can't use simply the possibility that you might owe some money as a basis for disenfranchising someone. That if there isn't clear evidence that, yes, here's the amount you specifically owe, just the mere possibility that we don't know if you've paid, that can't be used as a basis for preventing someone from registering to vote. And then you come to the additional issue then for someone who's unable to pay that. Does that burden then become an unconstitutional barrier to voting rights? And that's something that I expect over the years to come we'll be seeing more and more court challenges raising as applied challenges of that nature.
One thing seems certain: there will be no lack of litigation coming out of several things that have occurred in recent years here in the state of Florida and elsewhere when it comes to election law and several other topics as well. We talked about.
May I
yeah,
chime
please
in on
go
this?
ahead, Keith.
I think that decision was a political decision to deny these individuals the right to vote. The majority of us, two out of three of us who voted, interpreted that to mean once you have completed your sentence. And to many of us, that meant once you have been released from incarceration, you should have your voting rights restored. And that was the majority of Floridians. The decision to modify or to interpret that differently was done by a minority of people, our elected officials. And again, I say to those who will listen, let's look at the parallels of what is going on in the United States of America and what went on in Germany 100 years ago. This should frighten the living jackrabbit out of us because these parallels are scary to me. So that was a political decision.
I also wanted to say, I think it brought back to mind the idea of poll taxes, because I mean, how can you make that type of requirement for someone who has gotten his or her voting rights restored, and tell them that if you owe the state any money, then you can't vote? What if you made that type of requirement for every citizen? If you owe the state money, you can't vote. There'd be millions of people all over the state who wouldn't be able to vote. So it obviously was a double standard, and a lot of people equated it to a poll tax because essentially you could say that pretty much is what it is.
I think we have time for one final question. Don't we, Christine? Okay. In several other states, we saw attempts to subvert election results through efforts to derail certification, and there were calls for recounts and even sham audits after the results were settled officially. Do we have any protections in place to prevent those kinds of faux recounts in Florida? Some people had been calling for that to occur, even though their particular choice of a president won Florida quite handily. But still, there were calls for a recount in Florida. Could that still happen, you think?
Well, typically, I think not just in Florida, but in states in general, in order for there to be a requirement of an automatic recount, there has to be a margin of like 0.5% or less. If one candidate hasn't won more of a victory than 0.5%, there's a requirement of an automatic recount. And if you've been keeping up with Pennsylvania, the U.S. Senate election with Dr. Oz, in that situation, they just call for an automatic recount. So typically, that's the way it happens. But in some cases, you hear so many allegations about voting fraud that some people call for recounts and audits, even when it's not been really proven that they're even necessary. So that's something not just in Florida but nationwide that usually there isn't a recount simply because someone wants one. There has to be like a close margin of victory in order for there to be one.
Thank you. Ms. Sharon.
Thank you all very much. Let's have a big round of applause for our whole panel and Tom, the moderator with the most. Thank you all so much for your wisdom and insights. I think the audience would agree we could listen to you all night because this is a big topic, maybe even into the weekend. So thank you very much. And now we are going to shift our evening a bit. But first I want to, I can't see beyond the blinding lights, but we do have Commissioner Rick Minor with us here. He was standing back there somewhere. Commissioner, there he is. He's over there. A big thank you to Commissioner Minor for being here with us this evening as well. So now it's time for you all to interact a little bit. So this is a Created Equal tradition. Some would say it's probably their favorite part. Shh, don't tell the panelists because they were really awesome. But you all get to interact with each other. So this is, as we say at the Village Square, where the real magic happens. I know it sounds cheesy, but trust me, there will be magic happening at your tables. So you get to have your real and candid and respectful conversations about the topic at hand. Don't worry, we got some little prompts to get you started. So if you're at the big tables on the floor here, those pretty little fish bowls in the middle are not like a little raffle drawing, but those are your audience prompt questions to help you get started, unless you have some of your own already. And then if you're up in the upper seating areas, there's full sheets of questions for you. Don't feel like you have to stick to the script or anything. Don't be that one that hogs the conversation either, because we're going to take about like maybe the next 25 minutes to do this. And then when we come back in together, before we wrap up the evening, we'll have just a couple little shares from the audience, like really brief ones. But if you had some like real gems or nuggets and you don't mind speaking into a microphone that we bring around to you, be prepared to do that. Okay, but remember, the goal here is not to change each other's minds necessarily. And it's not to judge each other's opinions or experiences or, lives that we've had, but to really listen with an open heart and an open mind like we do at all Village Square events. And I will point you to our handy little table rules that you'll see sitting in the beginning. I'm not a real big rule person, but these will just help you as little guidelines, and they're kind of common sense reminders of how to be nice humans to each other. But just, trying to give you a little bit of guidance. If you're not sitting with a group already, maybe you can join in with each other. It is nice to have a few extra people rather than just a one-on-one, because that's what this is, meant to be a little group conversation. But we will bring the house lights up just a little bit so you can actually see and read those questions. And enjoy. We'll be kind of wandering. Our panel is going to come down and wander around too, so they might have some little extra nuggets, and they want to hear all of your thoughtful conversations too. So we hope you'll hang out and have this fun with us. There is still, I believe, probably some food left and some drinks to enjoy as well. So enjoy your conversations.